Thank you all for attending today's program. We are so grateful to the JCPA for convening a series of timely and important programs on today's critical issues, as well as partnering with the various communities around the country. The Jewish Community Relations Council of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation is honored to be a co-sponsor of this program, along with the Jewish Agency for Israel. We are grateful to the Jewish Agency for its deep engagement in facilitating this important session. During these times of uncertainty, isolation, and fear, and with the world facing multiple crises, gathering as a community fills us with hope that we will get through this together. Today's program is a reminder of this hope that we must hold for a better future. Last month, Israel and the United Arab Emirates announced a historic agreement and the normalization of ties, only the third such agreement with an Arab country in Israel's history. With increased cooperation in areas such as trade and tourism and positive people-to-people relationships forming, we are already seeing how transformative this agreement might be, with others hopefully to follow. Last week featured the first ever El Al flight between the two countries. A delegation from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs visited the UAE to sign a series of agreements. One of the participants on this trip was Lior, Haiat, one of today's speakers, and the spokesperson of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In this role, he communicates the positions and activities of the MFA to the world. Lior has served in the ministry for nearly 2 decades, including postings at Israel's embassies in Spain and Argentina. Most recently, he was the Consul General of Israel in Miami for nearly 4 years. We loved having him in Miami, and we are also thrilled that he is in such a meaningful role at the ministry now. We are glad to have the chance to connect once again. Joining him for this program is Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, the Executive Director of the Bronfman Center at NYU, and a little more than a year ago, in 2019, became the Chief Rabbi of the UAE. He has helped nurture its growing Jewish community. Few others have his knowledge and insight into Jewish life in the UAE today and what we can hope for in the future. We look forward to hearing from you both. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to the JCPA Board Chair, Michael Fromm.
Thank you, Tracey. My name is Michael Fromm. As Tracey said, I'm chair of JCPA, the network hub of 125 Jewish community relations councils and 16 national organizations. We're delighted to co-sponsor this webinar with the JCRC of the Miami Federation and the Jewish Agency for Israel. We're excited to hear from Mr. Haiat, who just returned from the UAE, and from Rabbi Sarna, who is its chief rabbi. I doubt many of us had an inkling of the announcement of August 13th, when the US, Israel, and the UAE declared the normalization of ties between the UAE and Israel. Many of us have been aware of the progress Israel had been making with the Arab states, particularly those in the Gulf, who share a common enemy in Iran. Unofficial visits and exchanges have been a regular feature of Israeli diplomacy, and we yearned for the day when this cooperation would be out in the open and growing in its impact. We were often told by Israeli officials that the parties were far away from a breakthrough, which depended upon the outcome of the Palestinian track. Yet here we are, potentially on the verge of a larger regional diplomatic breakthrough. On this webinar, we will discuss the current dynamics of the relationship between the UAE and Israel and the larger implications of this remarkable development. We appreciate you being with us today, Mr. Haiat. Please tell us about your trip, what you learned, and where we go from here.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for inviting me, the JCPA. I'm honored to participate in this webinar. And just before I started, you heard before, I just came back from Miami a few months ago after almost 4 years as Consul General of Israel to Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Puerto Rico. Probably the best 4 years in my life. So shout out to all the friends in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Puerto Rico. I miss you guys. And actually, on a personal note, after almost 9 months in Israel, a visit to Abu Dhabi was the first time I really understood that there was a reason why I left Miami. So I'll get to that in a few minutes. As you heard before, I'm a diplomat for the last 20 years. I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through the cadet course in 2001. And when my kids were younger, when they asked me, what do you do for a living? And as you know, it's kind of hard telling them or explaining to them what does a diplomat do. So I told them I work in constructions. I build bridges. And that was a cute way to explain to my kids what's the role of a diplomat. This is what we do. We build bridges between people. We build bridges between countries. We build bridges between cultures and economies. And this is basically what we've been doing in the historic delegation or visit to Abu Dhabi, where I'll get to in a minute. About 4 weeks ago, there was a huge announcement, a breakthrough in the relationship between the UAE and Israel, and they announced that we're about to sign a peace agreement between our two countries. It's a unique peace agreement because it's the third one that Israel signed with an Arab country, but the first one we signed with a country that actually we'd never had war with. It was we were never in war with the UAE, and there is, most of the people now know, there were a lot of under the radar or behind the scene relations between Israel and the Emirates. Actually, for the last over 2 decades, the last 25 years, Israeli diplomats are going back and forth to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, working and building the infrastructure of what we are now seeing, and creating the right basis for the breakthrough that took place just over a month ago. And this is basically what the role of a diplomat. We build the basis for the future relations, and now we have to build the basis not just for the relation, but the peace between the people. And a few days after the huge announcement, we decided that it's time to go officially to Abu Dhabi and start talking about the peace agreement. What are the main issues that we want this peace agreement to contain, and also to include, and also what kind of a peace we'll have between Israel and the Emirates. So there was a huge announcement about the first El Al plane El Al flight going to Abu Dhabi, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs decided to send a small delegation to prepare the talks, and I was lucky enough to be on that delegation. Actually, I got the phone call early on Wednesday morning 2 weeks ago. Said you have to run to get your COVID-19 test as quick as possible. I said, why do I need a COVID-19 test? They said, because you're going tomorrow to Abu Dhabi. I still remember the shock on my face, and said, okay, let's go. In less than 24 hours from that moment, we were on the plane. Unfortunately, we couldn't go on a direct flight yet, so we went through Europe, and it was quite a trip over 18 hours on the way to Abu Dhabi. And it was my first time there. Actually, it was my first time let's say, with this uniform going into an Arab country, and we really didn't know what to expect. The idea is that we are still in a way unofficial, although we did get to Abu Dhabi with an Israeli passport. There was a special delegation by the local government to receive us straight from the plane. They took us on a different path to the VIP lounge, and we the day after we started having the conversation with our host, and in a way each and every thing we did that week was for the very first time. We were the very first delegation to arrive in Abu Dhabi officially. We were the very first delegation or diplomats to step into the Emirati Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the front door. There were other talks in the past that were, as I said, under the radar or behind the scenes. But and there was, we were the very first ones to actually post on social media our the photos from the meetings and our stay there. The highlight, without a doubt, of this visit was the moment that the El Al flight landed in Abu Dhabi. Also, for the very first time, we mentioned that it was the first direct flight from Israel to Abu Dhabi, but it was also the very first time that Saudi Arabia allowed Israeli planes to fly over its skies. And instead of flying for 18 hours as we did, or almost 18 hours as we did, it took them 3.5 hours to get from Ben Gurion Airport to the Abu Dhabi Royal Terminal in the airport. A few minutes before the plane landed, they raised the flags. Again, for the very first time that Israeli flags are officially raised in Abu Dhabi. It happened before in Dubai in a sports competition, but not for an official delegation. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs came to the airport to receive our delegation. For the next 24 hours, we had talks with or three-way talks with the Emiratis and the American delegation that came with us, and there were a few issues to discuss. The main one was to establish diplomatic relations. Besides the peace agreement, we wanted to open an embassy in Abu Dhabi, hopefully very soon, and then consulate general in Dubai, hopefully a few weeks or months after. And we want them to open their embassy in Israel as soon as possible. We also want Israelis to be allowed to visit the Emirates. We already created a system, a program that will allow Israelis to ask for visas. And actually, we also created a system that will allow people from the Emirates to visit Israel. One of the main issues, especially for the host, from the host point of view, was the financial connection. A few days before the visit, the president of the UAE decided to cancel the economical boycott that was a state law in the UAE for more than 50 years, sorry, from 72 years, more than almost 50 years, economical boycott on Israel, which will allow local Emiratis to do business with Israel. And while the delegation was there, we signed the first protocol that will allow Israeli banking system to connect to the local system. This is a major step towards allowing business and trade to flow between Israel and the Emirates. The next thing was direct flights. We are already talking about flights, both El Al flights and El Intihad flights from Israel to Abu Dhabi and Dubai. A few days after the delegation was back in Israel, Saudi Arabia announced that it will allow any flight going from and to the Abu Dhabi and Dubai to fly over its skies, which basically means that every Israeli flight that will land in the Emirates will be allowed to go over Saudi Arabia, which will be a major change, not only on the connection between Israel and the Persian Gulf and the Emirates, but the entire Asian continent, because it will shorten the trip from Israel to India by half, or almost half, and it will obviously allow more trade and more tourism to go both ways. There were also talks about public diplomacy, culture ties, even science and space research. The Emiratis are very similar to Israel in the way that they see innovation. We're probably both Israel and the UAE, two of the most innovative countries. I don't know if in the world, but obviously in our region. And then we are trying to build those bridges that will connect the Israeli innovation with the innovation that is very advanced also in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So those were the main topics that we talked. The idea was to create the basis for the peace agreement, and the huge announcement that was we all heard yesterday, that on the September 15th, less than a week from today, a delegation from Israel will arrive to Washington, D.C. to sign the agreement with the delegation coming from the United Arab Emirates. The first businessman delegation, or the very first trade delegation from the Emirates, landed in Israel yesterday, and we are looking for more and more business opportunity to be the basis of this peace. It's a different peace, or we're expecting that to be a different peace than we have with Jordan and with Egypt. The peace with Jordan and with Egypt was basically the end of a situation of war. We had wars with those two countries, and we stopped them, but the peace relations basically were held on the level of the leaders. We are talking about a different peace between people, the two people, the Emirate people and Israel, the Israeli people. We are talking about tourism and trade that we hardly have with Egypt or Jordan. And in a way, it's also peace between two very similar countries because of the strategic situation and also the economical situation. In both cases of Jordan and Egypt, Israel was in a position to support or help or cooperate with them on issues that are necessary there, like water, agriculture. In the Emirates point of view, they have a lot of things that we can actually learn from them, a lot of the technologies that we can apply in Israel and not only export to them. I'm short on time, and I would like to share with all of you a few of the photos that I took while in Abu Dhabi. I'll try to do that. I'm not sure how tech I'll be, but I hope you can all see that. This is a drawing that was made by an Israeli artist showing the first landing of an Israeli plane in Abu Dhabi, but actually this is the actual plane we took from Frankfurt, Germany to Abu Dhabi. I have to tell you, the excitement to walk into this an aircraft, a plane that never accepted Israelis on board before, was quite an issue. This is right after the landing. This is the VIP lounge in the Abu Dhabi. You can see the photos of the royal family, and actually the leaders of the Emirates. If you visit the Emirates, you'll see those photos almost everywhere. This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the MFA of the Emirates. And I took this photo because it's from this angle. This is the main gate. You can hardly see that because it's behind the trees. But this is the first time that we actually walked through that door to have meetings with local diplomats. This is how diplomacy is being done today. Most of the work we did and the communication through our cell phones. This is actually minutes before the El Al plane landed. And now you can see the flags, both Israelis, Emirates, and American flags, and at the Royal Terminal in the Abu Dhabi airport. Let me see if I can show you. This is history. This is when the El Al plane landed. Obviously, as a spokesperson, while the plane was taxiing through to the main ceremony or the welcoming ceremony, I had to give an interview to a local Israeli television, and we did a lot of interviews also with local press. This is Al Hura, one of the main TV channels in the Arab world today. I have to tell you, one of the amazing things that we saw, or especially I felt when I was there, was to see how curious the local press and people that we met with are about Israel. The questions were about culture, the questions were about trade. Most of them are looking forward to visiting Israel. They were talking about visiting Jerusalem, obviously, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but a lot of them were talking also about visiting Tel Aviv. They look forward to going to the beach in Tel Aviv. They consider Tel Aviv to be a cool and a cold city comparing to the heat that they live in the Persian Gulf. This is also an example. This is one of the main newspapers in the Emirates on the day that the Israeli delegation arrived. As you can imagine, press in the Emirates has a lot of connections to the government. They are not a democracy. There is a special connection between the social or the companies and even the newspapers with the government, and to allow this kind of a front page in a major newspaper, it's all part of what we consider to be an historical, not only an historical day, but an historical occasion for them as well. Those are a few photos with my new friends from the Emirates. They were actually coming to us, asking to take the photos with us. On the top left side is a photo with the spokesperson of the Emirates Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Al-Otaiba. If this name sounds familiar, her brother is actually the ambassador of the Emirates in Washington. And this is a photo that says it's all 24 hours after this plane landed in Abu Dhabi, we took off back to Israel, and there was an official delegation standing in the airport, waving goodbye. And actually, this was a message sent by them. This is your welcome here. We want to have this connection. We want to have this peace agreement and live in peace with Israel, and they want to be leaders in the entire Middle East for other people and other leaders to follow them. So this concludes the short slide show, and I'll leave the floor to you, Michael.
Sure. Michael, you're muted.
I'm happy to. There we go. I am not muted anymore. Lior, I want to thank you for your insights, but most importantly for the visual insights. What an amazingly remarkable way to see the impact of your trip, and you were able to bring to life what we read about in the papers. We're very interested to see how this relationship unfolds and what it means for world and regional peace. And I'd like to remind our audience, if you have questions, please submit questions in your control panel. We'll have a short Q&A after Rabbi Sarna's presentation. And we're interested in, to that point, the people-to-people coexistence opportunities as well. So I'd like to bring on Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, who's the Chief Rabbi of the Jewish Council of the Emirates, and he will discuss with us what's happening on the ground in the UAE and the vision for the future, as well as how this new accord is being seen on the ground. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and it's really a privilege to be speaking on this panel. Let me just say a word about how I got to this moment, and then what's currently happening, and ultimately some important things that I think for that American jury could be aware of, and play a very, very important role in ensuring really what Lior said is that this is a warm peace and a peace truly between peoples with all kinds of exchanges. And I think American Jewry has a critical role to play in ensuring that this comes to fruition. I live in New York City. I go to the UAE pre-corona roughly once every other month since I was appointed Chief Rabbi in February 2019. But let me just back up a little bit before that and try to outline a little bit about my role. And I would say that I'm not the person who's in the room where it happened. I'm not a political person. I happen to have been in some of those rooms before things happened, probably be in the same rooms after things happened, but I'm not a in the room where it happened kind of person. I've been working at New York University since 2002, running the Bronfman Center for Jewish Student Life at New York University. That's NYU's Hillel. And in the shadow of 9/11, post 9/11 climate, especially in New York City, there's a rising Islamophobia. And I found myself kind of brought into, as a Jew, as a rabbi, efforts combating Islamophobia, 2006, 2007. And it was right around that time that NYU, which has campuses all over the world, 6 in Europe, South America, and Australia, etc., was looking to establish itself in the Middle East. And it landed on 2 places, actually. One was Tel Aviv, which opened its campus in 2010, and the other was Abu Dhabi, which also opened its campus in 2010. And so there is a New York University in Tel Aviv, and there's a New York University in Abu Dhabi. The one in Abu Dhabi is a 4-year college, not just a study abroad site. And it really, as the plans for NYU Abu Dhabi got underway, it was not just simply another university campus, but really a national project. And there was criticism of NYU at the time about kind of sharing with something that's distinctly American, distinctly Western with the Arab world. And some of that, truthfully, was linked to a rising Islamophobia, which came as a result or related to 9/11. To my surprise, I was invited by John Sexton, president of New York University at the time, to come to Abu Dhabi to help interview the first cohort of students, high school students, who are coming from all over the world to gain admission to NYU Abu Dhabi. These were recruited through 600 college guidance officers around the world, and certainly my first experience in an Arab country, or as a Palestinian friend of mine would say, my second experience in an Arab country. And it really opened my eyes to the possibilities of global education. And I've decided that because I was invited as the rabbi of New York University, that was the way I was going to travel. I didn't take my kippah off. I didn't get a new passport without Israeli stamps. I didn't hide my tzitzit. I walked around like I do on the streets of Manhattan. And I brought my talit and tefillin with me. And I would go back once or twice a year since 2010. Until 2015, I learned that in the neighboring emirate of Dubai, it's about an hour and a half drive away, there had been a weekly minyan, a weekly service that started every Shabbat in different people's homes. And I reached out to Ross Kriel, who was the main organizer. And I said, listen, Ross, I've been coming to the UAE since 2010. I'm a post at New York University. I think it makes sense for us to get to know each other. And he invited me to give a shiur class in his home. And I'll never forget that night. It was shortly before Hanukkah. And it was about 20 people, actually each one from a different country, who came to the UAE not because they were forced out of their country of origin. I mean, people coming from US, Canada, different countries in Europe, South America, different places in the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, Morocco. And but they were coming and they were staying. They decided to stay because they felt safe, and sometimes even safer than they felt in their home countries, the countries that they came from, particularly those who were from France, the UK. And secondly, for economic opportunity. And I decided to give a class on the placement of the Chanukiah, of the Hanukkah menorah. The original design was for the menorah to be outside the home so that everybody could see that this is a Jewish home and celebrate the miracle. But that at times of danger, where there was something dangerous about me mentioning that you were a Jew, you could move the menorah inside, put it on your kitchen table, so at least the members of your household can see. And I presented these texts and then waited for the reaction. And it was like I struck a raw nerve, because the stories that came out there were really the stories of a community in transition. People saying things like, I've always felt welcome, but I've never really told people that I was Jew. Or I tell my friends that I'm a Jew, but I tell my kids who are in school not to say that they're a Jew. And there was a negotiation, both in terms of people as individuals, but also what about as a collective? And Ross, who was the organizer, said, you know, I know that the government is welcoming us. We feel protected, we feel safe, they know what we're doing. And yet we feel a little hesitant. A few months later, I got a call from Ross, who said that the community feels like it's just about ready to, instead of meeting in people's homes, establish a synagogue. They banded together and prepared to lease a villa, which had previously been rented by a Jewish family, which had been the natural convener over holidays and things like that. And they banded together and they kind of dedicated this space in 2017 for that purpose. And it was not lost on me how historic this was, the first new Jewish community to be established in the Arab world in centuries. And we kept in touch, and I would advise them, guide them any way that I could. And in 2018, it was announced that that following year, 2019, would be known as the Year of Tolerance. An official visit of the Pope was planned, and several other announcements, including national building projects, to really undergird and to integrate this idea of tolerance, to further integrate, I should say, into the national ethos, the national consciousness. And towards the end of 2018, for the first time, Ross and the others agreed to have a story written about their kind of secret synagogue. I would say it was less secret, but more private. And as well, they wrote a short history of the Jewish community, which was published by the Ministry of Tolerance in a book called Celebrating Tolerance. And this was the first local history of the Jewish community that really laid out, what it was that people were doing, what their sentiments were, what their feelings were. And to give you a sense of the level of hesitation, when the chapter was written, there were no pictures of anybody's faces. But by the time, just a few months later, the book was ready to be released, there was actually a picture of someone's face, Jewish, wearing a talit, on the cover alongside members of about a dozen other religious groups. In February of 2019, shortly after the Pope's visit, the community, which had been working on a constitution, had a general meeting. They approved a constitution which accounted for all different kinds of religious expression, liberal streams, Orthodox streams, Chabad, and everybody in the community really came together and constituted what they called the Jewish Council of the Emirates. And again, that included a Chabad rabbi who was on the council, and included a Reform person and all different kinds. And I think the council invited me to serve as chief rabbi, particularly because of my experience running a pluralistic entity, running a Hillel in New York University, as well as my affiliation with NYU. And I told them at the time that I'll try to visit as much as I can, but I really see my primary function as being able to, in time, in coordination with the government and with their interests, slowly bringing the Jewish community of the UAE onto the grid of global Jewry. And this had many starts and stops. I did not imagine at the time that my role would be a very public role. I imagined that I would just, pitch in wherever I could. And I was surprised, actually, just about a month or two after the appointment, I'd met Lana Nusseibeh, who's the UAE ambassador to the United Nations, truly a magnificent, magnificent leader. Those of you who have seen Lana through the AJC platforms, invitations, etc., know just how special she is. She invited me to come and speak at the UN at a very special gathering, and I'll share this story with you in a little bit of detail because I think it encapsulates so much of what I think is available, is present in our very moment. She said that the UAE was hosting the 50th anniversary luncheon of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. That's the entity composed of the 57 Muslim or Muslim majority countries. And the UAE was hosting. Antonio Guterres was the headliner. And the UAE had decided, Lana had decided that they wanted the theme to be one of religious tolerance. And she'd invited, alongside Guterres, she invited their permanent representative from the Vatican. And she said, if it's okay, we'd like to invite you to speak a little bit about what it's like being Jewish in the UAE and the nature of the Jewish community. And of course, I agreed. I thought to myself, what an amazing opportunity to speak to the ambassadors of 57 countries, of Muslim majority countries. When else would a rabbi have that kind of opportunity? And then it struck me that I had just met her. And the feeling of trust that I felt from her to kind of put me up on that stage, in that platform, with almost a complete trust, really moved me. And I remember walking into the room, and coincidentally, that day was actually Yom HaShoah, was Holocaust Memorial Day. And I know what you know about sometimes in Arab countries, Muslim countries, the different relationship to the Holocaust. And I did not know whether or not to mention it, but then I also thought, how could I not mention it? I actually took Guterres to the side and I said, today's Yom HaShoah, do you think I could? And he said, you have to. And I shared in that moment, I shared the story of my wife's family, part of which was saved in Berlin by an Arab doctor, Mohammed Helmi, who is the only, to date, recognized Arab righteous among the Gentiles by Yad Vashem. And he had a Jewish patient family, which was my wife's family, who he took a liking to. He had stood up against the Nazis. He was publicly against Hitler, and arranged things so that my wife's great aunt could undergo a kind of a fake conversion to Islam in the hopes that she could fake marry his Egyptian cousin, get an Egyptian passport, and then leave. And ultimately, she survived the Holocaust, in part because she was under Mohammed Helmi's patronage. So what I took from that story is that the commitment of the UAE to tolerance is not just about lip service. It's real. It's real. And in so many ways, both then and before then, and since then, we've seen this real, authentic commitment to wanting the Arab world to be a place that is not just for Muslims. Many people have used the term, following the Abraham Accord, a new Middle East. It's not so much about a new Middle East, it's more about an Abrahamic Middle East. In fact, this accord is named the Abraham Accord. The fact that the multi-faith center that they're building on Arabian soil, mosque, church, synagogue in Abu Dhabi, that's going to be completed in a few years. Separate buildings, mosque, church, synagogue, but linked by gardens and an educational center. Major national building project set to be a global monument, really, is something that's truly extraordinary. Jewish community there is still very small, but what we're seeing, what we're observing, is that the platform of this Jewish community to be a lighthouse Jewish community, that is a base within the Arab world through which all kinds of cultural exchanges, meaningful cultural exchanges can occur, is truly phenomenal. I just wanted to end with just one comment, which is that what we've seen on the political stage, and again, I'm not a political person, but my observation is that there have been many men who've been involved, and I think, especially in the role of within diplomacy, I think it's very important for women to have a very active role. And so I've announced that I'm going to have a kind of small advisory committee, which is going to be co-chaired by the Canadian ambassador to the UAE, Marcy Grossman, as well as someone who is likely known to many people in the audience, Yehuda Nonu, who was formerly the Bahrain ambassador to the United States, and the two of them are going to help advise me and hopefully play a significant role in things going forward.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. As you can imagine, we have a number of questions, but I think it's important to start with the fact that the JTA just broke the news that President Trump has been nominated for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the normalization agreement between Israel and the Emirates. And Lior, I'd like to ask you the question of what your perspective was on the U.S. administration's role in the process.
Well, I think that it's a great question. We couldn't have done it without the help of our friends in the U.S. This is a huge effort by the Trump administration to help Israel achieve this breakthrough with the one second, please. And it's a huge help by the American administration to help us achieve this breakthrough. This is as I said before, we couldn't have done it without them. And we see that it's not just their goal in the achieving or getting Israel to achieve diplomatic goals in the region, but also the agreement that they signed with Serbia and with Kosovo, a change in the moving of the embassy of Serbia to Jerusalem, and the building of the new Kosovan embassy in Jerusalem is also part of that. I think we always say that Israel has no better friend than the U.S. In the last few weeks, we see that very clearly, and that's the
matchmaker in this agreement, has a lot of or gets a lot of respect from us and a lot of appreciation, because, as I said, for 25 years we've been working there under the radar. Without this support from from Washington, I don't think we would have received this breakthrough in the peace agreement that we'll sign next week.
Thank you. Rabbi, a question for you. In your experience with the community in the Emirates, did you feel that the citizens were on board with this agreement? Has there been any resistance from groups within the country that you can detect?
As far as what anybody in the Jewish community has heard, there's not just an excitement, but an exuberance. And it's really, just the enthusiasm that Lior described, the palpable enthusiasm, the similar cultural values, similar views on innovation, education, health. I mean, there's just such a natural bond. Of course, it goes without saying there are always going to be critics, but I think what we're seeing both in Israel and the United States is a very strong kind of bipartisan, or in the Israeli sense, multi-partisan support for this agreement in ways that I think, frankly, are so unique and so shocking that itself is miraculous. And within the UAE, similarly, just the kinds of exuberant responses that people have been hearing is tremendous. I do have to say that the role of civil society, the role that American Jewry, American philanthropy, American Jewish organizations, educational institutions can play is critical in ensuring that the possibilities here are realized. So we need to do our own part within the US, within Israel, in examining our own stereotypes of Arabs that have developed over years. Maybe there are things that we need to be more conscious of or change in curricula or other things. Similarly, maybe there are the other kind of stereotypes that we need to dismantle. And so we have our own work to do as well. And I think that Lior mentioned some of the areas that the Emiratis are ahead. The commitment, the real commitment that they've made to tolerance ought to be an inspiration to all of us.
Lior, any comment on that same question?
No, I think that the Rabbi was right on that in almost every meeting we had with officials, Emirates, they mentioned that there are over 200 nationalities, or people from 200 nationalities living in the UAE, and they are very proud of it. They are looking for Israelis to come and work with them and live there and visit, obviously, to be tourists there. And when I said that there are a lot of points or connections between Israel and the Emirates, this is another one. I think that Israel also is a multicultural society. We are dealing with this multiculturalism in one way. They are dealing with it in a different way. But basically, with the fact that in Abu Dhabi you can basically hear any kind of language talked on, well, I wouldn't say on the street. It's about 120 degrees in the street. So basically, in the mall or in the restaurant, you'll hear any language possible. The same thing happens in Israel, and this is another way to connect us. They are very open for and very curious about new cultures, and they are looking forward to having Israelis be part of this.
We have a lot of questions about the discussions that may have occurred regarding the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and particularly whether or not the decision not to apply sovereignty was a precondition for this accord, and also about the impact and influence that this new accord and others like it may have on a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So, Lior, I throw that to you.
Okay, I really hope, and we get this question a lot, and I think that first of all, we have to understand that this breakthrough in the relationship between Israel and the UAE came within the framework of the peace plan, the American peace plan for the Middle East, and the peace plan basically talked about relations between Israel and the Palestinians, and then the second circle with other countries in the region. I really hope that the Palestinians would learn from the Emirati leadership to take to seize the opportunity and to take the road towards peace. This is it will make this the agreement with the UAE will make the Middle East or bring stability to the Middle East and obviously prosperity to the two people in two countries, but it can also lead to a breakthrough with the Palestinians. We could look at the countries that supported the agreement, that is basically most of the countries in the world, and that we can look at the countries that criticized the agreement between Israel and the UAE, and we can name Iran, and we can name Hezbollah, and we can name Turkey and Hamas, and unfortunately also the Palestinian Authority. On which side do you want to be? You want to be in the side that basically promotes terror and violence in the Middle East, or you want to be in the side that is achieving peace in the region? As we say, the ball is in their Palestinian court today. They have to take the decision, and I really hope that they'll take the right one towards peace.
Lior, do you feel that the Palestinians will feel pressure from their counterpart Arab countries to come to the table?
I think they already do, because for years the Palestinians held the relationship between Israel and the Arab countries hostage to the advances between Israel and the Palestinians. We see that this policy is basically breaking or failing, and they no longer have this card on us that if you want to have good relations with Arab countries, you have to go through us. I think there is another message there. Some Arab countries are getting tired of supporting a Palestinian policy that is not advancing towards peace and paying a price for it, because having relations with Israel is a huge thing for Arab countries. It's a huge potential for them, and they see Israel as the value of having relations with Israel, and they don't want to pay a price anymore because the Palestinian leadership does not want to go back to negotiate peace with Israel. It doesn't mean that they don't support the Palestinian cause or the creation of a Palestinian state. This is a different issue, but they don't want to be the ones paying a price while the Palestinian leadership are not doing all they can in order to promote peace between them and Israel.
I think it's fair to say that our audience would love to spend the next hour on this subject, but we're limited in time, and I'm going to throw the last question to Rabbi Sarna. I know there are people who are wondering about the composition of the Jewish community in the Emirates. Where are their roots? Where are they from? How big is the community? And are there opportunities for people-to-people programs and coexistence in a country that has primarily not been a friendly home for Jews? But what do you see the future looking like for the Jewish community in the Emirates?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say that I think it's always been a friendly country for Jews. I think people have kind of made their own decisions at their own discretion about how open to be. But there are members of our community who, in their 40s, who actually grew up in the UAE, whose parents are originally from Europe, and basically grew up with their own little secret. Now, the community is still very small. It's, let's say, a few hundred families. The largest events that have occurred have had 150, 180 people around the holidays. And the thing that are very exciting is, we've announced a number of partnerships, explorations really, with different Jewish organizations, Jewish Agency for Israel, who's a co-sponsor of this program, the American Jewish Committee, AJC, which is going to be opening an office, hopefully, with Jewish Federations of North America, which will serve as the primary philanthropic vehicle for American and Canadian philanthropy. With the ADL, it's going to help us track anti-Semitic, anti-Emirati, anti-American tropes that are developing within the region outside of the UAE as a result of the Accord. So I'm very excited about these partnerships. There are more that are going to be announced. Again, each of these is not finalized yet, but that's really what we're exploring. And we're building our capacity to try to become a lighthouse Jewish community, one that enables Jewish communities around the world to encounter this part of the Middle East, and vice versa. The Abrahamic Family House is going to be really in 3 languages. It's going to be in English, it's going to be in Arabic, and it's going to be in Hebrew. That was a decision that was made even before the Accord was signed. And so, from my perspective, peace, especially a warm peace, is like coming across a deer in the woods. You're very excited, you want to see, you want to come close, but you don't want to scare it away. And so we can't go crashing through the woods. We need to always be reading each other's signals. We need to learn how to listen, as some would say, listen radically, listen to the root of what other people are saying. We need to learn the ethos. There is a different political culture between these 3 countries. But what is shared, and this is really the way I see it, is that the political process here, to a large extent, is the unfolding of a broader spiritual process, which is the family reunion of the children of Abraham. And as long as we keep anchored to that, I think we'll see a bright future.
Well, what a perfect way to end, because what I see here is a great sharing of insights on both the diplomatic and the cultural importance of this historic accord to the Jewish community and to the American Jewish community. And I want to thank you both for participating today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the JCRC of Miami Federation and the Jewish Agency for Israel. And most of all, really want to thank our audience for being a part of this discussion. If you enjoy JCPA's programming, please consider supporting our work by making a generous donation to JCPA. You can learn more by visiting our website, jewishpublicaffairs.org. It is 11:58. As promised, we will deliver our audience back to their normal schedule. Lior, Haiat, Rabbi Yehuda, Sarna, terrific day. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I hope that we'll have more important diplomatic developments to share with our audience in the very near future. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.
Shana Tova to everyone. Shana Tova, everyone.
Shana Tova.